The chandeliers in Margaret Sterling's Beverly Hills mansion glistened like ice sculptures above the clinking of champagne flutes. Waiters in crisp black uniforms floated silently between politicians, tech moguls, and heiresses who lounged on velvet sofas like royalty in a modern Versailles. Laughter drifted in elegant waves across the marble floor of the Sterling estate. Everything staged to perfection for Margaret's annual Hearts for the Homeless charity gala. Of course, none of the homeless were invited. At the far end of the room, near the catering station, 17-year-old Jayden Carter balanced a tray of hors d'oeuvres while watching his mother, Lena, fold napkins with mechanical grace. She had been in this house for 20 years, first as a cleaner, then a maid, then a fixture. But no matter how many silver trays she polished or table settings she memorized, she remained invisible, a background character in someone else's story. That night, Margaret Sterling wore a glittering black gown and a necklace that cost more than Jayden and Lena's annual rent combined. She floated among her guests with theatrical ease until her eyes landed on Jayden, tall, brown-skinned, standing too straight for someone in his place. "Come here, boy," Margaret said, her voice soft but soaked in command. "How about showing me how you play chess in the slums?" Conversation froze for a moment. Several guests turned, some pretending not to listen, others too eager to see what she would do next. Jayden blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. Lena's fingers tensed around the silver tray. She recognized the tone. Margaret wasn't extending an invitation. She was setting a trap. "There's a chessboard on the coffee table," Margaret added, gesturing toward the Italian marble set that sat untouched in the center of the room. "Hand-carved pieces from Florence. I'm sure you never played on something that isn't plastic." Laughter fluttered across the room like falling feathers. Jayden's grip on the tray didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A stillness, a quiet sharpening. Robert Ellis, a white-haired hotel magnate with soft hands and hard opinions, leaned toward his wife. "I bet he doesn't even know the night moves in an L shape." More laughter. Lena's lips pressed together. It wasn't the first time her son had been underestimated, but this was theater. And Jayden was being cast as a joke. "Carmen, no, Lena." Margaret corrected herself with a wave. "You can stop serving. I want you to watch your son play. It'll be educational for both of you." Lena stepped back, eyes on Jayden. "You don't have to do this," she whispered as he passed. Jayden didn't answer. He placed the tray down and approached the board. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because he was afraid, but because he was ready. He sat opposite Margaret, who already occupied the white side of the board like a queen presiding over court. "I always play white," she said. "It's a family tradition." Jayden said nothing. He began setting up the black pieces, aligning each one with surgical precision. His hands were calm. Too calm. Robert Ellis narrowed his eyes. Margaret grinned and addressed the crowd. "Let's make this interesting. If this young man can even make me sweat, I'll donate an extra $1,000 to, some public school." Polite laughter. Jayden didn't look up. Senator Grace Langley, seated near the French windows, raised an eyebrow. "Margaret, are you sure this is appropriate?" "Oh, come now," Margaret replied with a saccharine smile. "It's just a game." Jayden's mother stood at the edge of the room, twisting the cloth of her apron. She had scrubbed the tiles in this very parlor on her knees while Margaret hosted tastings for imported caviar. She had raised Jayden in silence while the children of the elite screamed across tennis courts. And now, they wanted him to perform. Like a magic trick, Margaret opened the match with E4. She smiled triumphantly, then announced, "That's the king's pawn opening. It's the classic Harvard approach. Very solid." Jayden looked at the board, then played C5, the Sicilian defense. A slight murmur moved through the guests. Robert Ellis frowned. "That's not something you just guess." Margaret laughed it off. "He probably saw it in a YouTube video. These kids memorize everything these days." Jayden made no attempt to defend himself. He just waited. Margaret played in F3, and he answered instantly with D6. As the moves progressed, the room grew quieter. Margaret began taking longer with each turn. Jayden never took more than a few seconds. His hands moved with the certainty of someone who didn't just know how the pieces moved. He knew why they moved. The board began to shift in favor of black. Margaret's smile started to thin. Jayden sat still, eyes low, face expressionless. But Lena saw the familiar signs. She had watched him study late into the night after long shifts at the hotel. She had watched him scribble positions on scraps of paper when they couldn't afford books. She had watched him memorize games by candlelight when the electricity was cut. And now, the game was his. Margaret leaned forward. "You're moving too fast. Real players take their time." Jayden finally looked up. "I've already taken years." Her jaw twitched. Grace Langley whispered to Robert, "That boy's not here to play. He's here to prove something." Jayden made another move. The tension rose. Lena stepped forward unconsciously. Something in the room had shifted. The laughter was gone. Only the sound of pieces clicking on marble remained. And Margaret Sterling, Queen of Beverly Hills, wasn't smiling anymore. The marble chessboard gleamed beneath the warm chandelier lights, each carved piece casting long shadows across the table like silent witnesses. Margaret Sterling, once the center of every room she entered, now leaned forward with rigid poise. Her manicured fingers hovered above the board with false confidence, while the boy across from her sat with the stillness of a hunter. Jayden Carter made his next move, knight to c6. Margaret blinked. "Developing his knight early," she scoffed, glancing toward Robert Ellis, who had suddenly stopped swirling his whiskey. "Isn't that a bit rushed?" But Robert wasn't listening. His sharp eyes remained locked on the board. "Knight to c6, Sicilian defense," he muttered. "This kid isn't just playing. He's playing theory." Senator Grace Langley leaned forward in her seat. Her wine glass sat untouched. "He's fast," she said softly. "Too fast for this to be luck." Margaret forced a chuckle and returned her attention to the game. "You're bluffing," she said to Jayden. "I've seen this before. You kids learn a few famous moves online and think you can beat someone who's actually studied the game." Jayden responded not with words, but with a pawn to g6. Another calm, calculated move. Margaret laughed theatrically. "He's just mirroring me now. Isn't that cute?" But Robert Ellis's face grew tighter. "He's building a dragon setup," he said under his breath. "Fast development. Bishop Fianchetto. This is no child's play." Margaret ignored the rising murmurs. She moved her bishop. Jayden followed with bishop to g7, exactly as expected in the accelerated dragon variation. The guests, who earlier had smirked and sipped cocktails with amusement, now watched with furrowed brows and stiffened shoulders. The tone had changed. No one was laughing anymore. Lena Carter stood at the edge of the room, arms folded tightly across her chest. She felt it too, something brewing beneath the surface. She had always known her son was exceptional, but even she hadn't seen him play under this kind of pressure. Now, he looked completely at ease, as if the boy had been waiting his whole life for this precise moment. Margaret hesitated before her next move. The delay made it obvious. She was losing her rhythm. To her guests, it was subtle. To Jayden, it was everything. He had studied opponents like her 1,000 times, arrogant players who played for ego instead of position. He'd memorized their mistakes, their greed for material, their fear of sacrifice. And Margaret was walking straight into one of his oldest traps. Jayden slid a knight to f6, solidify his control of the center. It was flawless execution. Margaret finally looked up and met his eyes. "How long have you been playing?" she asked, her voice sharper now. Jayden tilted his head slightly. 8 years. "Self-taught?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. Jayden didn't answer. Instead, he moved his queen's pawn. d6, a classic step in the dragon variation. Senator Langley shook her head. "He's not just good," she whispered to her husband. "He's precise. Every move fits like a key." "I don't like this," Margaret muttered under her breath. Her fingers moved a rook defensively, though there was no immediate threat. Her instincts told her something wasn't right, but she couldn't see what, and that was the brilliance of it. Jayden had turned the board into a minefield. Every square she entered was one he had already calculated 10 moves ahead. The guests began inching forward in their seats, drawn not to the glitz of the event, but to the growing spectacle unfolding before them. "Are you nervous, Mrs. Sterling?" Jayden asked quietly. The question hit like a pin dropped in a silent cathedral. Margaret chuckled, forced, then unconvincing. "Nervous? I played against CEOs and university professors. I'm not worried about a teenager." Jayden smiled faintly. "Then you should probably watch your bishop." Margaret looked down just in time to realize her bishop was under threat. But saving it would cost her queen position. Her breath caught. It was her first true mistake, and he had baited her into it. Across the room, Lena's heart pounded. She could see it in her son's face. The shift. He wasn't reacting anymore. He was directing, leading. He wasn't just playing Margaret. He was orchestrating the entire room. Margaret leaned back in her seat, the color rising in her cheeks. "That was luck," she muttered. But Jayden was already preparing his next move. His eyes were no longer scanning the board. They were locked on her, reading her panic like an open book. He remembered this woman. He remembered her ignoring him when he came to pick up his mother from work. He remembered how she never asked his name, only referred to him as the boy. He remembered how, once, she laughed when he asked if her library had any chess books he could borrow. And now, here she was, squirming under pressure. The irony was thick. Margaret reached for her wine, but her hand trembled. "You must have a coach," she accused. "Someone's trained you. No one learns this alone." Jayden looked at her, then back at the board. "I had one teacher," he said softly. "The public library." Senator Langley blinked, her expression softening. "That's impossible," she said. "Unless—" Jayden moved again. This time he created a fork, forcing Margaret into an impossible choice. Protect the rook or the bishop. Either way, she would lose. It was only the beginning. She chose the rook. Jayden punished the move swiftly, and the room gasped. Margaret's grip on control was slipping fast. Jayden's mind raced not with excitement, but with absolute clarity. Each move brought him closer not just to victory, but to something larger, something symbolic. He wasn't just playing a game. He was challenging the very assumption that he didn't belong. As Margaret stared down at the dwindling pieces on her side of the board, she realized something she hadn't felt in years. Fear, and it had nothing to do with losing the match. The queen sat cornered, not on the marble board, but in the mind of Margaret Sterling. To the rest of the room, it was still a game, but to her, it was becoming a spectacle, a slow, humiliating unraveling. Each move stripped her of another layer of control, of status, of illusion. Her wine now sat untouched, her smile reduced to a thin, trembling line. Across the table, Jayden Carter studied her silently, a soft intensity in his eyes that unnerved even the most seasoned guests. The game had shifted. The hunter had become the hunted, and Margaret felt it in her bones. Lena Carter stood in the corner, arms wrapped tightly around her waist. She'd never seen her son this focused, this fierce. He wasn't just playing, he was commanding. Senator Grace Langley exchanged a glance with her husband. "He's not reacting," she whispered. "He's orchestrating. It's like he's been waiting for this moment his whole life." And in truth, he had. Jayden remembered every insult. Every time someone in this house looked through him like he didn't exist. Every time he picked up dirty dishes from tables where children half his age talked about boarding schools and ski trips, while he sat up all night solving chess puzzles by flashlight. But it wasn't revenge he was after. It was respect. Margaret moved her bishop. An aggressive play, reckless, even. Jayden paused, then responded with a soft but bold gesture. Pawn e5. He had just sacrificed a central pawn. A murmur passed through the guests. "Did he make a mistake?" someone asked aloud. "No," said Robert Ellis, his voice barely above a whisper. "He just set a trap." Grace Langley leaned forward. "A pawn sacrificed this early in the dragon setup? He's baiting her." Margaret, of course, took the bait. "Finally," she exhaled, capturing the pawn with her knight. "You slipped?" Jayden said nothing, but his next move came within 2 seconds. Bishop to g4, pinning Margaret's knight and exposing her king's protection. She frowned. "What is this?" The board had transformed. Every piece Jayden moved wove a tighter web around her. What looked like chaos to the untrained, I was actually a calculated masterpiece. Robert Ellis, stunned, put down his glass. It's not just a dragon. It's a fast dragon trap. He's running a multi-layered attack. Jayden had spent years studying this exact sequence in obscure tournament archives. He had first seen it in a dusty Soviet chess book at the public library, one that hadn't been checked out in over 2 decades. He had memorized the lines by candlelight, while other kids played video games. He studied variations of the Sicilian defense. He knew Margaret's playstyle better than she did. Margaret now stared at the board like it had betrayed her. Jayden leaned back slightly, calm as ever. "Would you like to pause?" he asked. "I can slow down if it's too fast." The line drew a few nervous chuckles from the guests, but not laughter. Not anymore. Margaret's face flushed. "You think this is funny?" "No, ma'am," Jayden said, his voice level. "I think this is chess." Lena closed her eyes for a moment. She could hardly believe what she was witnessing. Her son, once just a quiet boy solving puzzles on scrap paper, was now schooling a millionaire in front of senators, CEOs, and socialites. And they were all listening to him. "I remember the day he asked me to teach him the rules," she whispered, mostly to herself. "He was 9. We didn't have a board. He used bottle caps for pieces." Grace heard her and turned. "You taught him." Lena shook her head. "I only knew how the pieces moved. He taught himself the rest." On the board, Margaret fumbled for a defense, but Jayden was already 3 moves ahead. His bishop lunged, creating a fork. Then his queen aligned with a central file. One more move, and he'd have double check. Margaret's hand trembled over a rook. "You memorize this. It's not real strategy. You just rehearse this like a play." Jayden's voice was calm and clear. "Isn't that what you're doing, ma'am?" Margaret snapped her head up. "What did you say?" He gestured to her tight posture, the fake smile she had returned to her face. "This whole night, it's theater. You invited me to be the comic relief. You wanted a story to tell over brunch. But you forgot one thing." Margaret narrowed her eyes. "I'm not part of your story," Jayden finished. "I'm writing mine." Gasps echoed around the room. Even Robert Ellis couldn't hide his grin. Margaret slammed her piece down, rattling the board. "You're being arrogant." "No," Lena said quietly from across the room. "He's being honest." Margaret stood abruptly. "This was a mistake. I don't know who trained you, but this is no fair match." Jayden stood too. For the first time, he addressed the entire room. "I wasn't trained by some grandmaster. I wasn't sent to a private academy. I learned from library books. I practiced on broken computers. And I played thousands of games online against strangers who never care about my name, my skin, or how much money I didn't have." He turned to Margaret. "And you wanted me to be a joke, but you made yourself one." The room went silent. Robert Ellis, unable to contain himself, stood and clapped. Once, twice. Grace Langley joined him. Then others followed. Margaret's face turned crimson. But Jayden wasn't finished. He looked around at the faces now watching him, not as a servant son, but as someone who had just earned their respect the hard way. He turned to his mother. "Mom, remember when I said I'd change everything?" Lena's voice cracked. "I remember." Jayden sat back down at the board, eyes back on the game. "Then let's finish this." Margaret sat too, but this time her posture had changed. She was no longer the hostess, no longer the queen, just another player about to be checkmated. The pieces no longer moved quietly. They struck like thunder, silent to the ear, but deafening to the pride. Margaret Sterling stared at the board as if it were a crime scene. Her white queen was cornered, her pawn scattered. The control she once wielded like a crown had slipped between her fingers. And across from her, Jayden Carter sat with the calm certainty of someone who had already won. The room no longer buzzed with champagne-fueled chatter. It held its breath. Jayden moved his rook with precision, aligning it directly with Margaret's king. She jolted. A mistake made 6 moves ago was now becoming lethal. "Check," Jayden said quietly. Margaret blinked. Her hands twitched toward the bishop, then recoiled. Every option led to disaster. I must have missed something, she muttered, eyes scanning frantically. No, this can't be right. It is, said Robert Ellis from his chair, his voice edged with disbelief. You're cornered. He's at least 3 paths to mate. Margaret turned to him sharply. Don't patronize me. I'm not, Robert replied calmly. I've played for 40 years, and I've never seen anyone, adult or child, trap someone this perfectly. Senator Grace Langley nodded in agreement. You're not losing because he's lucky. You're losing because he's better. The word stung like a slap across the face. Margaret's nostrils flared. She grabbed her queen and moved to a defensive square, exposing her rook. Jayden didn't even flinch. He captured it with cold efficiency. Another gasp echoed in the room. You planned that, Margaret hissed. I predicted it, Jayden said, 6 moves ago. The room fell deathly silent. Then he made his next move, bishop to f3. A sacrifice. Deliberate. Why would he give up the bishop now? Murmured a guest from the back. Robert Ellis sat forward slowly. It's the setup. Margaret didn't see it yet. She took the bait, snatching the bishop with her pawn. Then Jayden moved, and the board turned into a trapdoor. Checkmate in 3, Robert whispered, eyes wide. Margaret's head shot up. What? Jayden calmly moved his queen across the board, placing her directly in front of the stunned hostess's king. The queen stood tall and ruthless, a symbol of quiet retribution. Check, Jayden said again, his voice calm but final. Margaret reached for her knight, her last line of defense, but saw the next move. It wouldn't save her. It would only delay the inevitable. Jayden's face remained impassive, but his silence spoke of 100 late nights, 1,000 sacrifices, and the dignity of a boy who had refused to be anyone's entertainment. With a trembling hand, Margaret lifted her king, then let it fall. A soft clink echoed as it hit the board. Checkmate. For a moment, the room said nothing. Then Grace Langley rose to her feet. She clapped slowly, firmly, each beat a sentence. Robert followed, then Susan, then the rest. Margaret stood, red-faced, chest-heaving, her hands shaking as she reached for her wine glass. I demand to know who trained him, she stammered. No child learns to play like that on his own. Jayden finally looked up at her. You're right. I didn't learn alone. I learned from Kasparov, Fischer, Carlson. I studied every recorded game I could find. I watched them on a computer I fixed myself. Read books I borrowed from the public library. He turned slightly to the room. While my mom cleaned this house for 20 years, I sat on the floor outside the service door, solving endgames while your guests laughed about ski trips and private jets. Lena Carter stepped forward now, her apron tucked beneath her arm, her head held high. My son woke up every day at 5 to study before school, she said, her voice firm. He walked 6 miles to the library because we couldn't afford internet. When our lights were cut off, he studied by candlelight. Margaret dropped into her seat, drained of color. Her empire, built on assumptions and arrogance, was collapsing under the weight of truth. Grace Langley walked over to Jayden, her heels echoing across the marble floor. She held out a small white card. You're 17, right? Yes, ma'am, Jayden replied. She smiled. Call me on Monday. I know some universities that would love to meet you. Jayden nodded. Thank you. Margaret looked up at Grace, eyes wild with disbelief. You're offering him a scholarship? This was supposed to be a game. It was, Grace replied sharply. And he played it better than anyone else in this room. Jayden stood now, gathering the pieces and placing them carefully back in their slots. Thank you for the game, Mrs. Sterling, he said. It was educational. Lena walked beside her son, head held high. As they reached the doorway, she turned back one last time. Thank you, Margaret, she said softly, for reminding me that my son deserves much better places than this. Jayden opened the door, and they stepped into the cool night air, the golden lights of the mansion fading behind them. Back inside, Margaret sat frozen in her leather armchair, surrounded by the silence of judgment. The very people who had once hung on her every word now avoided her eyes. Robert Ellis sipped his whiskey and finally spoke. Margaret, You tried to humiliate him, but he made you human. That's the difference between arrogance and greatness. Margaret said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. 6 months had passed since the night of the checkmate heard around Beverly Hills. The video of the game, recorded discreetly by Senator Grace Langley, had gone viral. Though the footage didn't show every move, it captured enough to spark outrage, awe, and endless online commentary. The headline that swept across social media read, "Maid's son checkmates Beverly Hills Queen, a lesson in class, talent, and grace." Jayden Carter became a symbol, not of revenge, but of brilliance forged in adversity. Interviews, scholarships, and TEDx invitations followed. But Jayden never leaned into the spotlight. He had one goal: finish high school quietly and begin his next move. Now, walking across Stanford University's Palm-lined campus in a Stanford red hoodie, Jayden kept his head low as students passed him by. Some recognized him. Most didn't. He preferred it that way. What most people didn't know was that Jayden had kept a secret. One not even his mother Lena was fully aware of. One rainy Saturday, he sat in a quiet campus cafe with Senator Langley. She had become something of a mentor since the match, connecting him with professors and helping him navigate a new world of opportunity. "You know," she said, sipping her espresso, "I've watched that video 100 times. Your composure, your strategy, it was otherworldly." Jayden nodded. "I practiced for that moment my entire life." She smiled. "But here's what I don't understand. You once said you were self-taught. Completely. But there were a few sequences in that match. Things I've only seen in archive tournaments. You studied those games." Jayden paused, setting down his cup. His eyes met hers, steady, quiet, but filled with something unspoken. "I wasn't entirely alone," he said. Langley leaned in, intrigued. "Go on." Jayden reached into his backpack and pulled out an old, dented laptop. The screen flickered as he opened an email archive. He turned the screen to her. The subject lines all read. From E4 Master to J. Carter Chess. Next challenge. Positional pressure. Your Sicilian trap variation. Grace Langley's eyes widened. "You had a coach?" "Sort of." Jayden said, "Since I was 12. I don't know who he is. I only knew him as E4 Master. Every week, he sent puzzles, analysis, breakdowns of Grandmaster games. He never revealed his identity. Never asked for anything. Just guided me." He opened one of the messages. "The Accelerated Dragon is about tempo, not power. You'll win not by pressure, but by patience. She'll walk into it because she'll underestimate it, just like everyone underestimates you. Use it." Langley stared at the screen in silence. "He was my real teacher," Jayden said, "but I don't know who he is." Then Grace slowly exhaled. "I think I do." Jayden frowned. "What?" She reached for her phone and tapped a contact. After a few rings, a familiar gravelly voice answered. "Robert Ellis," she said. "I'm sitting with Jayden." There was a pause. Then Robert's voice came through the speaker. "Ah, so the prodigy has finally figured it out." Jayden sat upright. "It was you?" Robert chuckled on the other end. "Partially. I had a student, years ago, who taught me more than I ever taught him. When I saw you at the Sterling Gala, I recognized your posture, your calculation. It was eerie." "You were Margaret's friend," Jayden said, still processing. "I was," Robert replied. "But friendship ends where injustice begins. You needed a path, not a spotlight. I knew if you played long enough, the board would reveal the truth." Jayden stared down at the messages, stunned. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because," Robert said gently, "I wanted you to know what it felt like to win on your own, without obligation, without owing anyone." Grace smiled and ended the call. Jayden sat in silence for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "So, I wasn't as alone as I thought." "No," Grace replied. "You just had an ally in the shadows." That night, Jayden sat in his dorm, staring at the ceiling. The weight of what he had learned didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like closure. All those years, he thought he had been pushing forward alone. But someone had seen his fire and fanned it from afar. He called his mother. "Mom, Remember when I used to say I had a guardian angel in the game? Lena laughed softly. You always said that. Why? I finally know who it was. She smiled through the phone. Who? Jayden looked out the window at the quiet Stanford courtyard. A friend of the enemy. Meanwhile, in Beverly Hills, Margaret Sterling sat in her parlor, the Italian chessboard still occupying its central place. But it was never played on anymore. The guests had stopped coming. The invitations had dried up. Her social capital had crumbled faster than a dropped wine glass. Worse still was the realization that Robert Ellis, her oldest friend, had been the hidden hand behind her downfall. And he hadn't done it out of malice. He had done it because he saw something she never did. Talent where she only saw status. Worth where she only saw class. Jayden Carter had not just beaten her at chess. He had revealed the flaws in the game she had played all her life. And Robert had helped him do it. The applause faded, but the echoes remained. 6 months after walking out of Margaret Sterling's mansion into the California night, Jayden Carter now stood at a podium in Nairobi, Kenya, facing an audience of global leaders, educators, and journalists. The stage was part of the UN Global Youth Summit, and the banner behind him read, Rewriting the Rules, Equity, Talent, and the Future. Jayden didn't wear a suit, just a charcoal sweater and slacks. Simple, honest. A boy who once studied chess by candlelight, now preparing to share his story with the world. He took a breath and began. I learned the rules of chess before I learned the rules of the world. And I've spent most of my life realizing how similar they are. In both, your opening position often depends on where you're born. But in both, strategy, focus, heart can rewrite the board. The crowd was silent. Listening, he continued. I was the Maid son, the invisible one, the kid who cleared tables at charity dinners he could never afford to attend. I didn't have tutors or private schools, but I had a game. A 64-square universe where nothing mattered but logic and patience. Jayden looked up, eyes scanning the hall. And when I finally had the chance to play against the powerful, I didn't play to win. I played to be seen. A standing ovation followed minutes later. Backstage, Senator Grace Langley stood with Lena Carter, both beaming. I've never seen him so confident, Lena whispered, blinking back tears. He's not my little boy anymore. Grace smiled. No, he's everyone's now. Back in the U.S., Jayden's life had taken on a rhythm, part academic, part mission. He was now in his first year at Stanford, studying engineering with a concentration in system strategy. But his real passion was growing something bigger, the Open Square Initiative. What had begun as a side project had become a national movement. The Open Square connected underprivileged youth with volunteer mentors, many of them university students and amateur chess players. Through its online platform, children from low-income communities across the country were learning not just how to play, but how to think strategically, patiently, powerfully. Within 6 months, over 1,200 students were enrolled. Major universities began to take notice. Google offered cloud support. Chess grandmasters offered to run seminars. CNN ran a segment called From Checkmate to Champion, the Jayden Carter story. When asked in an interview whether he considered Margaret Sterling his enemy, Jayden had answered with the same cool grace he displayed at the chessboard. She's not my enemy. She's just one of the people who taught me what kind of player I never want to become. And as for Margaret Sterling, the night of the infamous match became the beginning of her decline. She had lost more than a game. She lost face. Invitations dried up. Her name quietly disappeared from charity boards. Even her longtime friend Robert Ellis stopped returning her calls. But the real sting wasn't public shame. It was that she had watched greatness unfold in her own home and failed to recognize it. Sometimes the most painful loss is knowing you were part of history, but on the wrong side of it. She still kept the Italian chessboard. It sat under a dusty glass cover in her living room, silent and untouched. One evening, Lena Carter received a package. It was from Stanford. Inside was a framed certificate from the university, commending Jayden for academic excellence and outstanding contribution to student mentorship. Attached was a handwritten note. Mom, this belongs next to the candle you used when we had no lights. Thank you for being my queen. Jayden. Lena placed a frame on the living room wall beside an old, worn photo of Jayden at age 10, hunched over a hand-drawn chessboard made of cardboard and bottle caps. Above the frame, she pinned one more item, a gold-foiled certificate from the Open Square, recognizing her as its honorary founding supporter. 1 year after the Beverly Hills match, Jayden was invited back to the same neighborhood, but for a different reason. The California Youth Minds Conference was being hosted just 3 blocks from Margaret Sterling's estate. As Jayden stepped out of the car with Grace Langley and a group of young students, he paused and glanced toward the hill where Margaret's mansion stood. He could see the silhouette of the property through the dusk. A student beside him asked, "Isn't that where it all started?" Jayden smiled faintly, where she thought it started. Then he looked at the wide-eyed kids surrounding him, children of single moms, refugees, homeless shelters, each one eager to learn, to grow, to win. He continued, "But my real first match was in a tiny library with bottle caps and no electricity. This is just a sequel." In the final moments of the conference, Jayden stood before another chessboard. This time it was made of wood, handcrafted by artisans in Uganda, a gift from one of the partner schools. The pieces were uneven, imperfect, beautiful. A young girl, barely 9, sat across from him. Her name was Fatima. She had learned the game through Open Square just 3 months earlier. "You sure you want to challenge me?" Jayden teased, smiling. Fatima smirked. "You're good," she said, "but I've been studying you." Jayden laughed. "Fair enough. Your move." She opened with E4. He responded with C5. And just like that, a new game began, on equal ground, with no champagne, no prejudice, and no mocking crowd. Only strategy, only heart, only the game. And this time, everyone had a seat at the board.